Friends, colleagues, and every citizen watching today, we confront a question as urgent as it is unsettling. What happens when a troubled psyche, burdened with narcissism and instability, confronts the sacred duty of a nation's military? That collision, that rupture, is precisely what we observed in that moment when Donald Trump addressed his generals not as a commander-in-chief, but as someone bargaining for loyalty. From the earliest days of his ascent, he cultivated the myth of the strong man, a leader who would restore order, demand respect, wield power. That messaging resonated, but beneath the spectacle lies a deeper diagnosis, a personality fused with extremes, narcissism, fragile ego, and intolerance of dissent. It's a profile incompatible with democratic oversight. So when he turned toward the generals, the stage shifted. Rather than accepting the constitutional tension between civilian oversight and military autonomy, he demanded personal loyalty. He positioned himself less as the nation's leader and more as a mob boss, threatening ranks, careers, futures if generals failed to pledge fealty. To clinical eyes, these are not rhetorical flourishes, they are symptoms. A psyche that cannot contain challenge, that craves unconditional homage. At first glance, this may appear as raw theatrics. But the underlying dynamics echo a pattern seen in authoritarian systems. The tension between the narrative of strength and the reality of insecurity. His threats, his overreach, they stripped away theater and revealed a structural assault on civil military norms. The U.S. military is bound by oath to the Constitution, not to any one man. To demand that oath be redirected is to fracture the institution itself. Yet in that moment, a flicker of clarity emerged. The very chaos he unleashed exposed the pathology. For once, the public glimpsed the danger. This is not merely politics, it is a psychological crisis undermining democratic order. The bond between president and uniformed leaders, once sacred, now lies fractured, replaced by coercion. No spin, no rally, no speech can fully repair that break. The spectacle that followed revealed something more profound than political division. It was a live demonstration of psychological fracture. When Trump berated his generals for being too weak, it wasn't strategy. It was projection. An outward display of the inner turmoil that defines leaders trapped in cycles of insecurity and ego reinforcement. According to behavioral experts, this pattern mirrors what's known in clinical psychology as narcissistic injury, when perceived defiance threatens the self-image of a fragile leader, leading to rage and retaliation rather than reasoned command. The generals, sworn to uphold the Constitution, stood at an impossible crossroads. Obey the man or honor the oath. What the public saw as political theater, the military felt as a test of institutional survival. Leadership requires legitimacy, not intimidation, and yet, Trump's confrontation sought to substitute authority with dominance, respect with fear. This is where power becomes brittle. When the foundation of leadership is validation rather than virtue, it shatters under pressure. Experts in organizational psychology note that environments governed by fear inevitably erode trust. Once subordinates begin performing not out of respect but out of survival, decision-making collapses. Military order built on clarity, discipline, and hierarchy becomes contaminated by paranoia. It's a dynamic we've seen in failing regimes worldwide, from Stalin's purges to more recent populist movements that weaponized loyalty over competence. Within the White House, aides reportedly described oscillations between aggression and despair. A man who craved admiration yet distrusted everyone offering it. Neuropsychological studies suggest that chronic stress under such personality structures can distort executive function, amplifying impulsivity, eroding empathy, and driving erratic judgment. When paired with access to the most powerful military on Earth, that becomes not just a personal issue, but a national security risk. For the soldiers deployed abroad, watching their chain of command strained for political spectacle, morale faltered. For allies, the image of a destabilized commander signaled unpredictability at the highest level. And for citizens, the warning was clear. The danger was no longer theoretical. It had stepped onto the stage, fully visible, in uniform silence. In the aftermath of that confrontation, what remained was not strength but fracture. A widening psychological fault line at the core of American power. The military, an institution built upon cohesion and shared discipline, now found itself silently resisting the will of a leader who viewed loyalty as personal currency. Generals like Mark Milley reportedly began to operate with heightened caution, aware that the president's volatility could push the nation toward an unprecedented crisis. It wasn't rebellion, it was defense. Defense of structure, of legality, of the invisible moral spine that holds democracy together. Clinical observers argue that Trump's behavior aligns with traits of malignant narcissism, a fusion of grandiosity, aggression, and the constant need to dominate. In psychological terms, such a personality often equates disagreement with betrayal. The result? Escalation. Every challenge becomes a war. Every subordinate becomes a potential enemy. And yet, what makes this scenario chilling is not simply the diagnosis, but the scale. When that psyche occupies the highest office, the consequences reverberate globally. The armed forces, grounded in collective duty, confronted an individual demanding personal worship. And that is where the true rupture occurred. A soldier's oath is sacred precisely because it limits power. It prevents a single man from declaring himself the state. To demand otherwise is to invite the specter of authoritarianism disguised as patriotism. In that moment, what began as a psychological breakdown transformed into a constitutional stress test, one that exposed how fragile the balance between personality and democracy truly is. But paradoxically, from that chaos emerged clarity. Americans witnessed, in real time, the anatomy of instability. They saw that unchecked ego can corrode even the strongest institutions. Yet within that realization lies a chance for renewal. For democracies to survive, they must recognize the psychological dimension of leadership, that stability is not born from dominance, but from discipline, empathy, and self-control. When these vanish, power collapses inward, and history, as it has shown time and again, punishes those who mistake fear for leadership.